So what if I told you that a Houthi drone strike all the way over in the Red Sea is basically the only reason your mortgage rate isn't sitting at like 15% right now?
I mean, it sounds completely absurd on its face.
Right. It just sounds made up. We're totally conditioned to think of geopolitics and, our personal finance as these two completely separate universes.
Yeah, totally separate.
You watch the news to see the explosions on one side of the planet, and then you log into your banking app to see your credit card balance, and you just assume there's an absolute firewall between those two things.
Which is how most people get through the day, honestly.
Exactly. But today, we are going to completely dismantle that firewall. We've custom-tailored this deep dive for you, the listener, to untangle this hidden architecture of the world.
And it is deeply hidden, but once you see it, you really can't unsee it.
So true. We're looking at a recent and frankly mind-bending interview on Mari Nafel's channel. He had on the economist Jeffrey Curry.
A fantastic interview.
Yeah, and the mission for this deep dive is to trace an unbroken, invisible line from the whispers of, World War III in Eastern Europe and the Middle East directly to the purchasing power of the cash in your wallet right now. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, let's do it. So Curry drops us right into the deep end of the geopolitical pool, right? He starts with a premise that forces you to just immediately reevaluate everything you think you know about the news. He suggests that we aren't looking at isolated regional conflicts anymore. Like, the core argument he's tracking, and this is based on high-level conversations and market signals he's seeing, is that the war in Ukraine and the various localized conflicts involving Iran, they are no longer distinct theaters.
Wait, so they're merging?
Exactly. They are actively merging into a single, uncontainable global crisis.
Wow. And he really doesn't pull punches on how this merger is actually happening. Like, Curry points to a very specific aggressive strategy.
Yeah, he does.
He notes the circulation of these rumors, things he's hearing from people he deeply respects, that figures like Ukrainian President Zelensky and Western neocons are actively attempting to drag Iran into the Ukraine war.
Which is a heavy claim.
It's a massive claim.
Yeah.
And I need to jump in right here just to be crystal clear with you listening. Curry is throwing out some highly charged political theories here, right? Regarding the motives of Zelensky, the neocons, and later on we'll talk about Donald Trump.
Right.
And we are absolutely not here to endorse or debate the politics of those specific claims. We aren't taking sides on the political scorecard. Our job today is to neutrally report on what's in this source material and pull apart the economic and strategic mechanics of the world he's describing.
Exactly. It's entirely necessary to separate the political personalities from the structural mechanics, just to understand the gravity of what he's talking about.
Right, so let's look at the actual why and how of that theory. Why would Ukraine, a nation that is already fighting this grinding war of attrition against Russia, want to intentionally open a secondary front involving Iran?
I know. On the surface, inviting another hostile power into the fray seems suicidal. Like, why would you do that?
It makes no sense.
But if you look at the mechanics of global alliances, the logic actually becomes grimly apparent. I mean, Iran is one of Russia's primary suppliers of military hardware.
Right, the drones?
Yes, specifically the Shahed drones. Those are the ones that have just devastated Ukrainian infrastructure.
So the logic here is, if you can force Iran to become a direct, recognized belligerent in a wider conflict, say, by escalating tensions in the Middle East to the point where Israel or the U.S. is forced into a kinetic war with Tehran, then Iran suddenly have to keep all those drones and missiles for its own defense.
You nailed it. It's a strategy of horizontal escalation. If Iran is literally fighting for its own survival against American or Israeli assets, they simply cannot afford to put their weapons on cargo planes bound for Moscow.
Wow, that is dark, but it makes strategic sense.
It does. And furthermore, pulling Iran into a direct conflict fundamentally alters the resource allocation of Ukraine's allies, too.
How so?
Well, if the United States is forced to deal with a blazing inferno in the Middle East, it changes the entire calculus of how Western military aid is distributed, right? How it's produced and deployed.
Oh, I see.
It forces the West to fully commit its industrial base to a global war footing. And some strategists might argue that's the only way Ukraine can ultimately survive a war of industrial attrition against Russia.
Man, so it's less like a spreading fire and more like an earthquake taking out a load-bearing wall.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, like if the Ukraine conflict knocks out the wall of Russian energy and diplomatic isolation, the ceiling over the Middle East's precarious security arrangement just starts to crack under the redistributed weight. The pressure just transfers through the whole structure.
What's fascinating here is that is the perfect way to visualize it. Geographically distinct conflicts lose their boundaries because the supply chains of war, the drones, the artillery shells, the financial sanctions, the diplomatic leverage, it's all entirely globalized now.
Everything is connected.
Right. When you squeeze one node of the network, the pressure bursts out in another. And Curry's argument is that this pressure has now reached a critical mass where containment just isn't a viable strategy anymore. The theaters have officially merged.
Which brings up a really crucial detail. Curry mentions about how he even reached this point of no return, because he talks about the concept of the off-ramp.
Ah, yes.
The off-ramps.
In diplomacy, there's always supposed to be an off-ramp, right? A way to de-escalate, save face, and walk away before the actual missiles start flying. But Curry implies we blew past those off-ramps a long time ago.
We really did.
He specifically references a missed memorandum, like there was some sort of written agreement, an understanding that could have put the brakes on this whole escalation, that it was ignored. And he points to pride as the primary culprit, which I just find fascinating.
Why is that?
Because we usually analyze geopolitics purely in terms of cold, hard resources, right? Oil, territory, deep water ports. But he's citing human pride as the engine of a potential world war. Yeah, well, when analyzing international relations, we often make the mistake of treating nation-states like hyper-rational sociopaths, like they're just operating purely on a mathematical ledger of profit and loss.
Right, just robots doing math.
Exactly. But nations are run by humans, and nations themselves possess a collective psychology. So when Curry talks about a missed memorandum and the role of pride, he is pointing to the sheer friction of international diplomacy when national identity is threatened.
That makes a lot of sense.
A memorandum of understanding only works if both sides believe that agreeing to it makes them look strong, or at least reasonable to their domestic populations and their international allies.
Right, but if taking that off-ramp requires admitting a fundamental mistake, or maybe conceding territory that has been mythologized as sacred, or even just validating an enemy's worldview, the leaders will simply refuse to take it.
They will refuse it even if the mathematical alternative is catastrophic destruction. Pride, in this context, isn't just about a leader's personal ego.
Though I'm sure that plays a massive role.
Oh, absolutely it does. But it's also about the perceived survival of national legitimacy. If a government admits defeat or accepts humiliating terms, it risks internal collapse. So what do? They double down.
They ignore the memorandum.
Yep. They push the escalation further, hoping the other side will blink first. And when both sides operate on that exact same logic, the off-ramps disappear completely, and these localized conflicts fuse into something much larger and vastly more dangerous.
Okay, but wait. If the physical reality of the situation is this dire, if the theaters are merging, if the off-ramps are gone, and if the global structure is cracking under the weight of this collective pride, why doesn't the United States just leave?
That is the big question.
Right. This is the massive hypothetical that Curry introduces. He uses Donald Trump as the archetype for this completely isolationist approach. And again, just analyzing the mechanics here, not taking sides.
Yeah, strictly the mechanics.
Why can't the American president just look at this tangled, intractable mess in Ukraine and the Middle East, declare the sunk cost, pack up the aircraft carriers, and just bring everyone home?
Well, it is the ultimate temptation of isolationism. The appeal is incredibly strong, especially to an American public that is just exhausted by decades of foreign entanglement.
Just pull the plug. Let them sort it out themselves.
Exactly. But Curry systematically dismantles the fantasy that walking away is a simple, clean operation. He breaks down the chaotic state of play to show just how far American control has already slipped and what a total withdrawal would actually mean on the ground.
The details he uses to illustrate this loss of control are really striking because they aren't theoretical. He talks about physical infrastructure being targeted right now.
Yes.
We are talking about the Houthis actively striking Saudi oil production facilities in the Middle East. Simultaneously, you have Ukrainians launching drone strikes deep into Russian territory, hitting refineries and severely disrupting naval operations in the Black Sea.
And this is the crux of Curry's observation, right? The United States, despite having a massive naval armada parked in these regions, is failing to deter these strikes.
The deterrence is just gone.
It's gone. The U.S. is expending million-dollar interceptor missiles to shoot down $1,000 Houthi drones, and yet the disruption to global shipping and energy infrastructure just continues.
It's totally asymmetrical.
Wildly asymmetrical. The actors involved are pursuing their strategic objectives regardless of American oversight or threats.
So Curry poses this rhetorical dilemma. Does it actually matter if the U.S. is involved from an oil perspective? If the Houthis are going to strike Saudi production anyway? Does American involvement in the Black Sea matter if Ukraine is going to unilaterally target Russian refineries against the wishes of Washington?
Right.
The implication is that American leverage is largely an illusion at this point.
It's a very provocative assessment of declining imperial power. Curry is suggesting that the U.S. is currently paying all the costs of maintaining an empire, the military deployments, the financial aid, the diplomatic headaches, but reaping none of the benefits of control.
They're paying the bill but not getting to eat the meal.
Exactly. The deterrence has failed.
Yeah.
So he takes the thought experiment to its logical conclusion. What happens if the U.S. genuinely steps back?
Right. What if an American president says, you know what? We don't have the interceptors. We don't have the political will. This isn't our fight. We lost the war. Let's pretend we won, and we are leaving.
And the immediate physical consequence of that declaration, according to Curry, is the surrender of the Strait of Hormuz.
Wow. Okay, we need to pause on that. The Strait of Hormuz.
This cannot be overstated. The Strait of Hormuz is the most critical geopolitical choke point on the planet. Roughly 20% of the world's total global oil consumption passes through that narrow waterway between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman.
20%.
20% of all oil. For decades, the implicit guarantee of the global economy has been that the United States Navy will keep that strait open and safe for commercial shipping by force, if necessary.
So if the U.S. just packs up the Fifth Fleet and sails away, what does a surrendered strait actually look like? Because the apocalyptic assumption, to one you always hear, is that Iran immediately mines the water, shuts off the global oil supply, and the world economy crashes into a depression by Tuesday.
Right, that's the Hollywood movie version. But that is not what Curry predicts.
Right.
And this is where his analysis becomes incredibly counterintuitive and, honestly, brilliant.
Okay, I'm listening.
He gives us a very clear, almost business-like prediction of the fallout. If the U.S. pulls its defensive umbrella, the strait doesn't magically close forever. Iran doesn't want to permanently destroy the global economy. They want to profit from it.
Obviously.
So the strait simply opens under new management.
Specifically, Iranian and Omani management.
Exactly. It transitions from being a free lane protected by the American taxpayer to a toll road managed by regional powers. Iran and Oman would institute a new fee structure, a new set of maritime insurance requirements, and a new geopolitical toll for safe passage.
And it wouldn't just be the waterways that settle into a new transactional reality, would it? Curry predicts that in the vacuum of American withdrawal, the regional actors on land would essentially settle their own scores financially.
Yes, he brings up the Saudis and the Houthis specifically.
Right. Instead of an endless proxy war fueled by American weapons and Iranian ideology, they just do a deal. The Saudis, who have massive financial resources, essentially pay off the Houthis to stop dropping drones on their refineries.
It's a localized, highly pragmatic, deeply cynical, transactional peace.
Cynical is the right word for it.
Very. Without the overarching ideological umbrella of American intervention forcing everyone into pro-Western or anti-Western camps, the local powers just revert to pure self-interest.
Right.
The Saudis calculate that paying a bribe to the Houthis is simply cheaper than suffering ongoing infrastructure damage and fighting a grinding war.
Okay, I have to stop here because this is the pivot that completely threw me when I was reviewing his arguments. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Go for it.
Under this hypothetical scenario, the U.S. leaves, Iran runs the strait, the Saudis buy off the Houthis. After a brief period of shock and adjustment, the world just sort of moves on. The ships keep sailing, the oil keeps flowing. They just pay a different toll to a different authority.
That is exactly the architecture he is building. He is establishing that the physical flow of global energy wouldn't permanently stop if the United States abdicated its role as the global policeman. It would just be controlled and taxed by someone else.
So if the Middle East settles its own disputes and the strait remains open under Iranian management, what happens to the actual price of oil? Because if you are listening to this on your commute, you are probably wondering how this massive shift in global power translates to the price on the marquee at your local gas station.
Right, the real-world impact.
Yeah. In this isolationist ideal world where the U.S. completely extracts itself from the Middle East, Curry provides a very specific forecast.
He does. He states that in that scenario, assuming the Middle East stabilizes under its new management, you would expect global oil prices to sit somewhere in the $80 to $85 per barrel range.
Wait a second.
Yeah.
If peace breaks out, even a cynical, transactional bribed peace like we just talked about, shouldn't the risk premium evaporate? Shouldn't the price of oil plummet back down to like $50 or $60? Why is the floor 80 to 85?
Because, as Curry points out, the theaters have already merged. You cannot isolate the Middle East from the rest of the global supply chain disruptions anymore.
Oh, right.
Even with the Persian Gulf stabilized and those specific geopolitical chips taken off the table, the global market is still absorbing the shock of the other unmerged fires.
Russian refineries burning.
Precisely. Curry specifically points to the Caspian Sea issue
Yeah.
and the ongoing grinding reality of the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Which is still raging in this scenario.
Right. Russian crude and refined products are heavily sanctioned, and their physical production facilities are being destroyed by Ukrainian drones. That represents millions of barrels of oil that are either offline, severely delayed, or forced to travel through incredibly inefficient shadow fleets to reach markets like India and China.
That's a massive disruption.
It's a massive structural disruption to the global energy grid, and it's still hitting the markets. So the price drops a little bit from where it might be during a peak Middle East crisis, but it doesn't bottom out. It finds a floor around $80 to $85 because the global supply chain is fundamentally structurally stressed by the European theater.
All right, this sets up a massive logical dilemma then.
How so?
If the physical flow of oil continues under Omani and Iranian management, and the price of oil stabilizes at a manageable $85 a barrel, without the United States spending hundreds of billions of dollars and risking American lives to police the desert, why would the U.S. care? Why not just leave? If it isn't strictly about keeping the physical oil moving, what invisible tether is keeping Washington anchored to the Middle East?
And this is where we finally peer behind the curtain. This is the exact pivot point where Curry moves the conversation from the physical mechanics of regional geopolitics to the invisible architecture of global hegemony.
Okay, lay it on me.
He argues that walking away wouldn't just be a strategic military retreat from one region. It would mean the total, absolute end of American global dominance.
Because it's not about the physical barrels of crude, it's about the precedent.
It is entirely about the precedent. Curry asks us to visualize a highly specific, deeply symbolic scenario that would follow a U.S. withdrawal.
Okay, visualize what?
Imagine a world where a United States president has to ask the Ayatollah of Iran for permission to send the U.S. Fifth Fleet into the Persian Gulf.
Oh.
Imagine the U.S. Navy having to request a hall pass, pay a transit fee, and submit to Iranian maritime inspections just to sail through the Strait of Hormuz.
The psychological shockwave of that image is just staggering. I mean, the United States Navy, the most lethal, technologically advanced maritime force in human history, acting as a subservient client to a regional power in a vital waterway.
It completely irrevocably inverts the power dynamic that the entire world has operated under since the end of the Second World War.
Yeah, that's a paradigm shift.
It demonstrates to every other nation on Earth, to China, to Russia, to India, to Europe, that the United States is no longer the ultimate, unquestioned authority on the high seas.
But to really understand why asking Iran for permission would be such a catastrophic blow, to understand why Curry draws a direct line between this naval humiliation and the collapse of the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency, we have to look backward.
Yes, we do.
We have to understand how the United States got this job as the global security guard in the first place and why they get paid so well to do it.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to go back to December 1945. The ashes of the Second World War are literally still smoldering.
Right. Bretton Woods.
Exactly. This is where Curry provides a really necessary historical framework. If you look at the broad sweep of human history prior to 1945, the logic of global power was the logic of empire and extraction. Think of the Roman Empire or the British Empire.
Right. You build a massive army, you conquer a territory, you subjugate the local population, and you extract their resources, their grain, their gold, their spices, their labor, and you pull it all back to the imperial capital. To the victor go the spoils. It's a zero-sum game of plunder.
Exactly. That was the playbook for millennia. But Curry points out that the United States did something entirely unprecedented after World War II. They possessed the greatest military machine ever assembled, and they possessed a monopoly on the atomic bomb.
They could have easily adopted the traditional imperial model of conquest and extraction. They had the power to do it.
They absolutely did. But instead, they looked at a devastated world, including their former mortal enemies, Germany and Japan, and said, we are not going to conquer you. We are going to rebuild you.
The Marshall Plan, the establishment of institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which Curry explicitly mentions.
But we have to be clear here. This wasn't an act of pure selfless charity. It was the foundation of the most brilliant, lucrative strategic arrangement in human history. It is what Curry calls the grand bargain.
Let's break down the terms of this grand bargain, because this right here is the invisible source code of the modern world.
The terms were elegantly simple, but massive in scale. The United States agreed to use its unparalleled military force, specifically its deep-water navy, to protect global trade for everyone.
For everyone, not just allies.
Everyone. They promised to patrol the oceans, hunt down pirates, keep the sea lanes open, and guarantee that any nation could trade with any other nation without fear of their cargo being sunk by a rival empire.
And the primary commodity that needed to be shipped, the absolute lifeblood that required this unprecedented maritime protection, was oil.
This is where the technological shift of the 20th century meets the geopolitical shift. For the first time in human history, nations were building massive industrial supply chains that were completely dependent on resources located thousands of miles away.
Right. Like in the 19th century, if you wanted to build a factory in England, you relied on a coal mine in Wales. It was localized. But after WWII, if you wanted to rebuild the industrial base of Japan or West Germany, you needed oceans of oil from the Middle East. You needed energy from the other side of the planet.
Because of that absolute reliance on long-distance, vulnerable logistics, oil became the single most strategically important commodity on Earth. And the United States Navy guaranteed that this vital lifeblood could move safely across the oceans, underwriting the economic recovery of the entire free world.
Okay, so the U.S. provides free, heavily armed shipping insurance to the entire globe. That's what America gives in the grand bargain. What did they get in exchange?
In exchange, the rest of the world agreed to a fundamental financial concession. They agreed to use the U.S. dollar as the primary medium of global trade. They agreed to price their commodities in dollars, conduct their international settlements in dollars, and recycle their surplus capital through the financial institutions of New York.
Now, I want to clarify a timeline detail here, because Curry notes an evolution in this arrangement, right? The foundation of this system, the dollar as the anchor, was laid in 1945 at Bretton Woods, where the dollar was tied to gold.
Yes.
But Curry notes that the system we live in today, the true petrodollar system, didn't officially lock into its current form until 1971.
That's a crucial distinction. In 1971, President Nixon shocked the world by taking the United States off the gold standard. He completely severed the link between the paper dollar and physical gold.
Which theoretically should have destroyed the value of the dollar. If it isn't backed by gold, why would anyone want it?
Because shortly after that, the U.S. negotiated a masterstroke with Saudi Arabia and the OPEC nations.
And the agreement was, OPEC will only price and sell their oil in U.S. dollars.
Right. And in exchange, the U.S. will guarantee the security of the Saudi kingdom and the surrounding oil fields. So the dollar was no longer backed by gold in Fort Knox. It was backed by the indispensable necessity of oil and the lethal supremacy of the U.S. military.
When you lay it out like that, it honestly sounds like a global mafia protection racket, but one that actually fuels massive economic growth.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it.
I mean, the U.S. essentially tells the world, look, it's a dangerous ocean out there. We will provide the security. We will keep the pirates, the rival empires, and the regional warlords off your back. You can build your factories and ship your goods in perfect safety, but in return, you have to play in our casino. You have to use our chips, and we own the casino.
It is a system of immense, almost unfathomable leverage. The physical security of the world's oceans is underwritten by American military might, and the financial transaction of that security is conducted entirely in American currency. And as Curry points out, this grand bargain has worked incredibly well for a long time. It has provided the geopolitical stability that allowed for 80 years of unprecedented global economic expansion, the rise of the Asian tiger economies, and the lifting of billions out of poverty through globalized free trade.
But that brings us crashing violently back into the present day. That was the deal for the last 80 years. What happens when the security guard starts looking exhausted? What happens when the United States decides that policing the casino floor is too expensive, too politically toxic, and too dangerous?
Curry illustrates the present-day reality of this grand bargain with a specific, striking example that proves it isn't just a relic of the Cold War, and it isn't just about oil anymore. It's about the entire physical economy.
The copper example. I love this part of his argument.
It perfectly encapsulates the absurdity of the current system. Curry points out that today, right now, if a shipping container full of metric tons of copper is being moved across the Pacific Ocean from a port in Chile to a port in Shanghai, China, it is the United States Navy that is protecting those trading lanes.
Which is wild when you actually stop to think about the incentives there. You have a massive commercial transaction between South America and Asia. The copper is being dug out of the ground by Chileans, and it is being bought by Chinese manufacturers to build electronics or EVs. The United States is not a party to this transaction at all. In fact, China is the primary geopolitical and economic rival of the United States.
Yet, as Curry emphasizes, it is not the Chilean Navy protecting those cargo ships. It is not the Chinese Navy deploying aircraft carriers to secure the Pacific transit routes. It is the United States taxpayer funding the warships that ensure China receives the raw materials it needs to compete with the United States.
It seems completely irrational until you remember the grand bargain. The U.S. protects all trade, everywhere, because that is the service they provide in exchange for the world using the dollar.
Precisely. The U.S. isn't protecting Chinese copper out of the goodness of its heart. It is protecting the system of free trade that makes the dollar indispensable.
So we take that stark reality and we apply it back to the hypothetical scenario we discussed earlier. The theaters merge, the pressure mounts. The U.S. decides the Middle East is a lost cause and walks away. They surrender the Strait of Hormuz to Iranian and Omani management. The oil still flows, but under a new toll system.
This is where the entire 80-year architecture begins to unravel.
Okay, walk me through the unraveling.
If the U.S. loses control of the straits, or willingly surrenders them, Curry argues they have vividly and undeniably demonstrated to the entire world that they are no longer the global protectorate of global trade. The implicit guarantee of the U.S. Navy is suddenly revealed to be hollow.
And this triggers an immediate, highly rational reassessment by every other nation on Earth.
Right. This raises an important question. The rest of the world looks at the situation. They look at Iran managing Hormuz. They look at the Houthis dictating terms in the Red Sea, and they ask, why am I continuing to pay this tax to the United States?
Because using the U.S. dollar is absolutely a tax. It means submitting to American financial surveillance. It means being vulnerable to American economic sanctions. And it means constantly buying U.S. Treasury bonds to hold in your central bank, which essentially means loaning money to the U.S. government at favorable rates. It is a massive friction cost on global business.
If the United States is no longer providing the service, if they are no longer keeping the sea lanes safe, if they are forcing ships to reroute around Africa or pay tolls to regional warlords, the fundamental logic of the 1945 agreement evaporates overnight.
Yeah, why would they keep paying?
Exactly. Why should a country like India or Brazil continue to jump through the hoops of the dollar system and fund the American debt if the American Navy isn't protecting their shipments of oil and fertilizer?
This is the crux of the entire deep dive. This is the moment where geopolitics violently collides with economics. The crack in American hegemony wouldn't just be a localized political embarrassment. It wouldn't just be a bad news cycle for whichever president decided to withdraw from the Middle East.
It's way bigger than that.
Curry is arguing that this crack would instantly spread across the oceans. It sets a precedent for every other strait, every other choke point, every other contested waterway in the world. Once the United States is no longer viewed as the ultimate, reliable guarantor of free trade, the hegemonic currency, the U.S. dollar, becomes fundamentally threatened.
The link is absolute, and you cannot sever it. The military freedom of navigation across the world supports the petrodollar system, which in turn supports the dollar as the sole global reserve currency. You cannot abandon the military guarantee without eventually destroying the financial dominance.
Okay. If you are listening to this, you have followed us down a massive rabbit hole of Bretton Woods, petrodollars, and aircraft carriers. And you might be thinking, all right, I understand the geopolitical theory. The grand bargain breaks. The dollar loses its reserve status. So what? I don't run a central bank. I don't import metric tons of copper from Chile. I just live in Ohio or Texas or Florida. How does international maritime law actually affect my daily life?
The ultimate so what question.
So what does this all mean? Let's ask it on behalf of the listener. What does the death of the reserve currency actually mean for the person listening right now?
Curry answers this by introducing a vital economic concept known as exorbitant privilege. It's a term originally coined in the 1960s by a French finance minister who was incredibly frustrated by the American advantage. And Curry brilliantly explains this privilege by having us look at a completely different country today.
Switzerland.
Yes. Curry uses a very specific real-world example regarding Swiss real estate and banking to illustrate exactly what happens when your currency is in intense demand globally.
I was looking at this Swiss example in the notes, and the numbers are absolutely staggering if you are used to looking at American or British interest rates right now.
They really are. Curry explains the current dynamic because the world is incredibly chaotic right now. Wars merging, supply chains breaking, inflation spiking, massive amounts of global capital are fleeing risk and flooding into Switzerland. Global investors, corporations, and wealthy individuals view the Swiss franc as a supreme safe haven.
So everyone on Earth is buying Swiss francs to protect their wealth.
Exactly. Everybody is dumping their local currencies and buying francs, putting that money into the Swiss banking system. This massive influx of capital makes the Swiss currency incredibly strong, but more importantly, it absolutely floods the domestic Swiss banking system with cash.
The banks are literally overflowing with deposits from all over the world. And what is the result of that massive influx of capital for the average Swiss citizen who just wants to buy a house in Zurich or Geneva?
Curry reveals the staggering result. Because the banks have so much capital to deploy, the cost of borrowing plummets. A mortgage rate in Switzerland for a 30-year fixed loan was recently sitting at just 50 basis points.
We have to translate that for a second to really feel the impact. 50 basis points. That is 1/2 of 1%.
Right.
0.5% for a 30-year fixed mortgage. If you were an American looking at a 7% or 8% mortgage right now, a 0.5% mortgage sounds like a fantasy. It means the money is practically free.
It is an almost unimaginably low cost of capital. And Curry uses this Swiss phenomenon as a localized, concentrated illustration of the massive advantage a country gets when it holds a globally desired currency. Now, take that Swiss example and multiply it by 1,000 to understand the United States.
Because the United States doesn't just have a safe haven currency, it has the reserve currency. When the whole world is forced by the grand bargain to buy dollars in order to trade oil or copper or grain, they are essentially parking their national wealth inside the American financial system.
Right. The entire globe buys dollars, parks those dollars in U.S. Treasury bonds or American banks, and suddenly the U.S. domestic banking system is flooded with an ocean of credit. The Federal Reserve and the commercial banks have an enormous, artificially inflated pool of capital to dish out to American citizens and American corporations.
This is the lifeblood of the American consumer. This is the exorbitant privilege in action. It's what allows Americans to access credit cards, auto loans, business loans, and mortgages at the scale and frequency they do. The American lifestyle of debt-financed consumption is entirely subsidized by the rest of the world needing to hold dollars.
It is the invisible engine that keeps the American consumer alive. But Curry then introduces a terrifying, sobering statistic about exactly how dependent the U.S. has become on this privilege.
Yeah, this is the number in the analysis that really stopped me in my tracks. It quantifies the delusion.
Curry states plainly that right now, the United States is spending on its domestic economy roughly 7% more than what it actually produces.
7% more. We are consuming, as a nation, 7% more goods, services, and energy than we actually generate.
Which is a huge deficit.
We import televisions, cars, clothing, and machinery, and we pay for it with paper dollars that we literally just print. And the only reason that mathematical impossibility doesn't result in immediate hyperinflationary collapse, the only reason the world accepts the paper for the physical goods, is because they need the dollars to function in the grand bargain system.
Exactly.
The reserve status acts as a massive magical shock absorber for that 7% national deficit.
The exorbitant privilege bridges that 7% gap between American reality and American consumption.
So my immediate thought when looking at this, and I'm sure anyone listening is thinking the exact same thing, is, well, could the U.S. just adapt?
Adapt how?
Like if we lose the reserve currency status because we pull back from protecting the sea lanes and the world stops artificially subsidizing our debt, couldn't we just tighten our belts, pull back the spending, eat the loss, and rebuild?
Curry addresses that directly, and his assessment is pretty bleak. Taking that 7% deficit out of the domestic economy wouldn't just be an adaptation. It wouldn't be a mild recession where unemployment ticks up a point or two.
It's not just about what Curry calls super bullish oil prices at the pump. It's about a fundamental structural collapse of American purchasing power.
Think about the mechanics of extracting 7% of total consumption out of a massive economy overnight. If you take away the global privilege that allows a country to consume 7% more than it produces, you are talking about an overnight, violent contraction of living standards.
The cheap credit instantly dries up.
It vanishes. The banks no longer have the global deposits to lend out. Borrowing costs skyrocket, not just for mortgages, but for the federal government itself.
Oh, man, yeah. If the U.S. government has to suddenly pay 10% or 15% interest just to convince people to buy its bonds, the federal budget is entirely consumed by interest payments. Social Security, Medicare, the military budget, it all gets cannibalized.
The entire mechanism that fuels domestic consumption and government spending seizes up. The ability of the average citizen to finance a car, carry a credit card balance, or secure a business loan would evaporate. It would be an economic restructuring on a scale not seen since the Great Depression.
And we can trace that catastrophe all the way back up the chain of logic we built today. Why does the credit dry up for the guy in Ohio? Because the world stopped using the dollar for trade. Why did the world stop using the dollar? Because the U.S. stopped guaranteeing the safety of free trade on the oceans.
And why did they stop guaranteeing free trade?
Because the regional conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East became too complex, too merged, and too politically toxic, and the U.S. decided to finally walk away.
It is a continuous, unbroken chain of causality. Curry has shown us that a drone strike on a Russian refinery or a Houthi missile attack in the Red Sea isn't just a distant geopolitical event. It is directly tethered to the interest rate on your credit card.
It's incredible. We started this deep dive talking about the murky, broken charts of modern geopolitics. We were looking at rumors of merging wars and missed diplomatic off-ramps. And over the last hour, we've traced the hidden currents underneath all that noise.
We really have.
We've seen how the 80-year-old naval treaty, signed at Bretton Woods in 1945, is the invisible load-bearing wall connecting the survival of the American empire to the daily economic reality of the American citizen.
We've explored the immense hidden costs of maintaining American hegemony, but more importantly, the terrifying domestic price of abandoning it. We've seen that the choice isn't simply between fighting endless wars or enjoying domestic peace. The choice is between maintaining a global empire or suffering a devastating collapse in domestic living standards.
We've covered a massive amount of ground today, pulling apart Jeffrey Curry's brilliant and chilling framework. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final lingering thought. It's a question that wasn't directly answered in the source material, but it is the inescapable shadow hanging over everything we've just discussed.
If the United States does step back, whether by choice through isolationism or by force through military overstretch, and the grand bargain finally dies, resulting in the fall of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, what exactly replaces it?
That's the million-dollar question.
Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does global finance. How does a transition of that magnitude, a transition of total global economic and military power, actually happen in a world that is already teetering on the edge of merged, uncontainable regional wars? Has a global hegemony ever been replaced peacefully?
It's a question that should make you look at the daily news with a much, much sharper eye. When you see a headline about a cargo ship in the Red Sea, you aren't just looking at foreign policy anymore. You are looking at the foundational pillars of your own bank account. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning those surface-level narratives, keep looking for the underlying architecture, and we will see you next time.